In the freezing, mist-shrouded autumn of October 1628, the Texel roads in the Netherlands witnessed the departure of a titan. The Batavia, a brand new, state-of-the-art flagship of the Dutch East India Company, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, or VOC, slipped its moorings and stood out into the North Sea. She was a monumental achievement of 17th-century naval engineering, a massive, three-masted retort ship designed to endure the brutal year-long voyage to the Spice Islands of the East Indies. Her hull, a formidable fortress of seasoned Dutch oak, was reinforced to withstand both the crushing power of the open ocean and the artillery of rival European empires. Her upper decks bristled with 30 heavy iron and bronze cannons, projecting absolute colonial and commercial dominance. Yet, beneath the pristine white canvas of her towering sails and the freshly gilded, brightly painted woodwork of her stern castle, the Batavia carried a deeply unstable, highly volatile human ecosystem. She was a compressed, claustrophobic cage of wood, rope, and iron, containing 341 individuals whose clashing ambitions, desperate poverty, and hidden psychological sins were destined to trigger the most horrific maritime catastrophe in human history. To understand the tragedy that was about to unfold, one must understand that the physical layout of the Batavia was a deliberate, unyielding mirror of the rigid social hierarchy of the Dutch Golden Age. At the absolute apex of this floating society stood Commander Francisco Pelsaert. Pelsaert was not a traditional salt-hardened mariner. He was an elite upper-class merchant, a man of ledgers, diplomatic protocols, and meticulous administrative ink. Appointed by the VOC's board of directors, the Heren 17, Pelsaert possessed supreme authority over the ship, its crew, and the staggering wealth packed into its lower holds. He viewed this arduous voyage through a cold corporate lens. It was a commercial enterprise, a stepping stone to further cement his immense personal fortune within the company's global monopoly. Pelsaert was a bureaucrat governing a world he did not physically understand, relying entirely on the naval expertise of men he fundamentally looked down upon. Light years away from Pelsaert in terms of class and temperament, yet holding the physical fate of the ship in his hands, was skipper Arjen Jacobs. Jacobs was a brutal, weather-beaten, heavy-drinking veteran of the open seas. He possessed an intimate, unparalleled understanding of the erratic winds, the treacherous currents, and the high-stakes mathematics of 17th century navigation. However, beneath his rough, professional exterior lay a deep, festering, and borderline murderous resentment toward the wealthy VOC aristocrats. Jacobs loathed the reality that, despite his irreplaceable skills, he was viewed by men like Pelsaert as a crude, uneducated laborer, paid a fraction of the merchant's profits while taking 100% of the physical risks. This psychological friction between the intellectual elite at the stern and the bitter maritime veteran at the helm created a permanent, invisible fault line running directly through the ship's chain of command. It was precisely within this social fracture that a third, highly dangerous figure materialized, under-merchant Jeronimus Cornelisz. Cornelius was a 36-year-old bankrupt former apothecary from the city of Haarlem. He was highly educated, exceptionally articulate, and possessed a sinister, near-hypnotic personal charisma that allowed him to manipulate almost anyone he engaged with. In the deeply pious, strictly controlled Calvinist society of the Netherlands, Cornelius had been forced to hide a dark, radical secret. He was a devout, secret disciple of Johannes Terentius, a notorious heretical painter and philosopher. Terentius preached a terrifying antinomian doctrine. He argued that sin was an illusion, that God's grace was so absolute that the truly enlightened individual could commit any atrocity, murder, theft, sexual debauchery, without compromising their immortal soul. Having lost his business, his reputation, and his infant child to disease in Haarlem, Cornelisz had fled his homeland, securing the post of undermerchant on the Batavia. He did not view this voyage as a service to the VOC. He saw it as a final, desperate escape from the law and an unmissable opportunity to completely reinvent his destiny, through any means necessary.
The material reality of what lay directly beneath the feet of these three men only accelerated the ship's descent into paranoia. The Batavia was a floating vault of unimaginable riches. Packed tightly into heavy, iron-bound oak chests deep within the lower holds were 12 massive bags of silver coins, totaling over 250,000 silver guilders. This was an astronomical fortune, capable of funding private armies or purchasing entire fleets of merchant ships. Alongside this raw capital sat priceless historical treasures intended as diplomatic bribes for the Mughal Emperor Jahangir, including a massive, highly intricate Roman agate cameo, heavy gold jewelry, and rare, luxurious textiles. To a common sailor or a low-ranking mercenary on board, whose daily pay was a miserable pittance of a few stivers a month, this immense wealth was a blinding, omnipresent temptation. Every hour of back-breaking labor was spent walking just feet above an elite fortune that could instantly transform them from desperate, starving outcasts into wealthy gentlemen, if only they had the courage to seize it. While the elite officers and wealthy passengers enjoyed the relative comfort of private cabins, fresh livestock, fine wines, and clean water at the stern of the vessel, the living conditions of the common crew were designed to systematically erode their humanity. Over 200 sailors and infantrymen, poor mercenaries recruited from the war-torn, destitute gutters of Germany, France, and the Low Countries, were crammed into the dark, damp, and unventilated forecastle. The ceilings were so low that a grown man could not stand upright, forcing the crew to exist in a permanent, hunched posture of subjugation. The air was a suffocating, toxic soup of stale sweat, unwashed bodies, rotting oak timber, stagnant bilge water, and human waste. As the Batavia crossed the equator, the intense tropical heat turned the lower decks into a humid oven. Diseases like scurvy, dysentery, and typhus ran rampant, turning the forecastle into a chorus of moaning, dying men. The food rations, meant to last for up to a year, deteriorated rapidly. The hardtack became a crawling mass of weevils and maggots. The salted beef turned into a rancid green sludge, and the drinking water in the wooden barrels grew slimy, dark, and foul. The crew was trapped in a cycle of physical torture, their resentment toward the wealthy passengers at the stern sharpening with every rancid meal. It was in this fertile soil of physical misery and blinding greed that a terrifying, clandestine alliance began to form. During the long, ink-black night watches, as the Batavia charted her course through the Atlantic Ocean, skipper Arjen Jacobses and under-merchant Jeronimus Cornelisz began to meet secretly on the quarterdeck. They discovered their shared burning hatred for Commander Pelsaert and the corporate tyranny of the VOC. Cornelisz, utilizing his sophisticated, silver-tongued rhetoric, began to systematically dismantle the skipper's remaining moral inhibitions. He pointed out the sheer absurdity of their contracts. They were risking their lives to transport an empire's fortune across the globe, only to hand it over to fat merchants while they returned to poverty. With calculated, chilling precision, Cornelisz laid out a grand strategy, a total mutiny. He proposed that they wait until the Batavia separated from the rest of the fleet, systematically recruit a loyal corps of hardened executioners among the crew, murder Commander Pelsaert and the Loyalists in their sleep, and seize the ship. With the Batavia's 30 cannons and 250,000 silver guilders, they would transform the flagship into an unstoppable pirate vessel, plundering the immensely rich trade lanes of the Indian Ocean before escaping to a life of absolute luxury in Spain or the Americas. Jacobs was completely captivated by the vision of unlimited wealth and bloody vengeance. Together, the apothecary and the skipper began to carefully, methodically build their underground army. They targeted the most brutal, desperate, and heavily armed men on board, specifically the German mercenaries who felt no loyalty to the Dutch flag, and disgruntled sailors who had been subjected to brutal corporate floggings by Pelsaert for minor infractions. Cornelisz used his heretical philosophy to reassure these men, convincing them that the laws of man did not exist in the middle of the ocean, and that the gold in the hold belonged by natural right to whoever possessed the physical strength to take it. Small, secret meetings were held in the deepest shadows of the gun deck, where oaths of loyalty were sworn in whispers over stolen bottles of company wine.
By the time the Batavia rounded the Cape of Good Hope and entered the vast, terrifyingly empty expanse of the southern Indian Ocean, the conspiracy had expanded to include over 30 heavily armed, completely desperate mutineers. The ship was now a ticking time bomb, running blind through the water at the whim of a skipper who was intentionally altering the navigation course to isolate the vessel from the rest of the fleet. The conspirators stayed awake at night, their hands resting on the hilts of their daggers, waiting for a single dramatic spark, a point of no return that would force the crew to choose sides and plunge the ship into a total bloodbath.
That spark was carefully engineered by Cornelisz and Jacobs in April 1629. They needed to trigger a crisis that would completely paralyze Commander Pelsaert's authority and force a violent confrontation. Their target was Lucretia Jans, a wealthy, exceptionally beautiful highborn woman traveling to the East Indies to join her husband, a prominent VOC official. Lucretia represented everything the mutineers despised: aristocratic privilege, unassailable social status, and refinement. One dark night, a group of masked mutineers, operating under Jacobs's direct orders, dragged Lucretia from her private cabin onto the main deck. In a brutal, highly coordinated act of psychological terrorism, they smeared her body with excrement and tar, violently assaulting her while ensuring she could not identify their faces in the dark. The objective was to force Pelsaert to launch a massive, heavy-handed investigation, arresting and executing suspects among the common crew. This, Cornelisz calculated, would trigger an immediate, panicked revolt among the sailors, allowing the mutineers to launch their counterstrike under the guise of self-defense. But Pelsaert, crippled by a severe, advancing tropical fever, failed to act with the necessary iron fist. He did not order immediate executions. Instead, he meticulously recorded the incident in his administrative logbook, intending to conduct a formal legal tribunal only after the ship reached Java. This bureaucratic delay left the mutineers in a state of high, agonizing, and paranoid tension. The atmosphere on board became thick with terror. Sailors looked at one another with deep suspicion. Weapons were secretly sharpened in the dark, and the loyal officers stayed awake in their berths, their hands resting on their loaded pistols. The Batavia was charging forward at maximum speed through completely uncharted, highly dangerous waters, her crew completely consumed by the impending slaughter, totally oblivious to the brutal physical reality of the ocean ahead. But Pelsaert, crippled by a severe, advancing tropical fever, failed to act with the necessary iron fist. He did not order immediate executions. Instead, he meticulously recorded the incident in his administrative logbook, intending to conduct a formal, legal tribunal only after the ship reached Java. This bureaucratic delay left the mutineers in a state of high, agonizing, and paranoid tension. The atmosphere on board became thick with terror. Sailors looked at one another with deep suspicion. Weapons were secretly sharpened in the dark, and the loyal officers stayed awake in their berths, their hands resting on their loaded pistols. The Batavia was charging forward at maximum speed through completely uncharted, highly dangerous waters, her crew completely consumed by the impending slaughter, totally oblivious to the brutal physical reality of the ocean ahead. By the first days of June 1629, the Batavia had become a ghost ship in all but name, completely severed from the physical and moral geography of the civilized world. Skipper Arjen Jacobs had done his job with terrifying efficiency. By exploiting the ferocious, unrelenting winds of the southern Indian Ocean, he had driven the 600-ton flagship hundreds of leagues off the standard VOC trade routes, successfully losing the rest of the fleet in the vast gray emptiness of the sea. There were no sister ships on the horizon. There was no backup convoy. There was only the Batavia, her massive oak hull groaning under the strain of the canvas, racing blindly through uncharted waters at a breakneck speed of several knots. On the night of June 3rd, the atmosphere on board was thick with an almost suffocating dread. Below decks, the air was heavy with the stench of stagnant water, sour wine, and the sweat of men who knew a slaughter was coming. The mutiny, planned by Jeronimus Cornelisz and skipper Jacobs, was mere days away from being unleashed. The conspirators moved through the shadows of the gun deck like phantoms, checking the edges of their cutlasses and whispering passwords in the dark. Commander Francisco Pelsaert remained confined to his cabin, his body racked by a violent, debilitating tropical fever that left him shivering, semi-delirious, and entirely incapable of governing the human powder keg beneath his feet. The ship was careening forward at the whim of a treacherous helm, guided by a skipper whose mind was entirely consumed by the impending mutiny. At approximately 4 a.m. on the morning of June 4, the sky was a deep, ink-black void, illuminated only by a cold, deceptive moon. High on the forward forecastle, a veteran lookout named Hans Boskieter stood shivering against the biting spray of the sea. As he squinted into the dark horizon ahead, his eyes caught something anomalous through the mist. It was not a sail, nor was it the silhouette of land. It was a long, wide, and violent line of white, ghostly froth breaking through the dark uniformity of the ocean. It looked as though the sea itself was boiling in the dark, or as if a massive, jagged white wall was rising from the abyss. Boskieter's blood ran cold. He was an experienced mariner. He knew that in these uncharted southern waters, white froth meant only one thing: shallow water crashing over a submerged reef. He lunged toward the deck below, his voice cracking with pure panic as he screamed down to the quarterdeck. "Breakers! Breakers ahead! Turn the helm!" On the quarterdeck stood skipper Arian Jacobs. When the lookout's screams cut through the roar of the wind, Jacobs stepped to the railing and looked over the bow. In his staggering arrogance, and with his mind heavily preoccupied by the logistical details of the upcoming mutiny, Jacobs completely dismissed the warning. He looked at the white line and calmly told the watch officer that it was merely a field of bioluminescent sea foam, common in these latitudes, or perhaps the moon reflecting off a massive migrating school of nocturnal fish. He refused to slacken the sails, refused to alter the course, and ordered the helmsman to keep the ship charging forward at full speed. It was a monumental, catastrophic act of hubris that would end the lives of hundreds. Minutes later, the physical reality of the ocean caught up with the skipper's delusion. With a deafening, cataclysmic roar that sounded like 30 heavy cannons firing simultaneously within the hold, the solid oak keel of the Batavia slammed directly into the razor-sharp coral of the Morning Reef, part of the uncharted Houtman-Abralos Islands off the coast of Western Australia. The impact was violent beyond comprehension. The immense forward momentum of the 600-ton vessel was brought to an instantaneous, grinding halt by the unyielding rock. The physical forces generated by the sudden stop ripped through the architecture of the ship. The towering main mast, thick as an ancient oak tree, snapped at its base with a sound like thunder, crashing down across the main deck and crushing dozens of sailors instantly beneath a tangled mass of heavy rigging and torn canvas. Below decks, the scene was a living nightmare. The jagged coral teeth tore through the bottom hull as if it were wet parchment. A massive, freezing torrent of black seawater poured into the lower forecastle, instantly drowning the sick soldiers and terrified passengers who were trapped in their sleeping berths. Commander Francisco Pelsaert was thrown violently from his bed by the impact, his fever-riddled body slamming against the cabin wall. Gasping for air, he dragged himself up the tilted, blood-slicked stairs and stumbled onto the deck. The scene before him was absolute, unadulterated chaos. The darkness was filled with the horrific shrieks of the dying, the splintering of wood, and the frantic shouting of men who had completely lost their minds to terror. Pelsaert found Skipper Jacobs standing by the shattered wheel, paralyzed with shock, his arrogance completely shattered by the reality of the disaster.
"Where are we?" Pelsaert screamed over the roaring surf, grabbing the skipper by his coat. "What have you done to my ship?" Jacobs could only point blindly into the dark, his voice gone. As the sun began to slowly crest the horizon, its pale light revealed the true, terrifying geography of their doom. The Batavia was firmly impaled on a jagged, submerged coral shelf. A few miles away, breaking through the white foam of the surf, lay a series of tiny, low-lying islands, flat, featureless strips of yellow sand and sharp limestone coral rising just a few feet above the high tide. There were no trees, no vegetation, no rivers, and no signs of life. It was a barren, skeletal graveyard of rock dropped into the middle of an indifferent ocean. The ship was disintegrating with terrifying speed. Every massive gray swell that rolled in from the open ocean lifted the stern of the Batavia and slammed it back down onto the coral, grinding the massive oak timbers into splinters. Pelsaert realized that the vessel would not hold together for 48 hours. He ordered the immediate deployment of the ship's two small boats, the longboat and the yawl, to begin evacuating the survivors from the breaking wreck to the nearest sandy strip of land, which would later become known as Batavia's graveyard. The evacuation quickly degenerated into a brutal display of human panic. The common soldiers and sailors, realizing that the corporate hierarchy of the VOC was collapsing along with the ship, abandoned all discipline. A large faction broke into the captain's luxury cabins and the upper alcohol holds. They smashed open the barrels of heavy wine and spirits, determined to get completely drunk before the ocean swallowed them. Men fought viciously over space in the small boats, using knives and fists to push women, children, and wounded comrades into the freezing surf to secure a spot for themselves. Dozens of men, loaded down with heavy winter clothing and stolen silver coins stuffed into their pockets, jumped into the water and sank like stones to the bottom of the reef. Over the course of 2 grueling days of constant rowing through the breaking surf, the longboat and yawl managed to ferry approximately 180 people to the small sandy island, but over 70 men remained trapped on the disintegrating forecastle of the wreck, surrounded by deep, shark-infested water that prevented them from swimming to safety. Among those left behind on the shattered bow was under-merchant Jeronimus Cornelisz. Cornelius could not swim a single stroke. He stood on the tilting bowsprit, watching the small boats row away, his highly analytical, psychopathic mind already calculating how to turn this catastrophic shipwreck into the ultimate opportunity for absolute, unrestricted power. On the beach of Batavia's graveyard, a new existential crisis materialized. As the 180 survivors gathered, shivering, bleeding, and weeping on the sand, they discovered a terrifying reality. The island was a completely barren wasteland. There was absolutely zero fresh water, no trees for shade, and no obvious source of food. The small amount of water barrels they had managed to salvage from the wreck was completely insufficient to sustain 180 people for more than a few days under the baking, merciless Australian sun. Commander Pelsaert and Skipper Jacobs realized that staying on this island meant a slow, agonizing death from dehydration. They made a desperate, highly controversial decision. They took the best, largest longboat, packed it with the senior officers, a few loyal sailors, and a small supply of their remaining water, and announced that they were going to explore the larger islands on the horizon in search of water springs. But after searching the main islands and finding nothing but salt pools and dry stone, Pelsaert and Jacobs did not return to the dying people on the beach. Driven by a mixture of survival instinct, cowardice, and fear of the starving mob, they turned the longboat north. They committed an act of monumental, historic abandonment. They decided to navigate an open 9-meter boat across 1,800 miles of uncharted ocean toward the VOC headquarters in Java, leaving the 180 survivors behind on the reef with no leadership, no weapons, and no water. Back on the wreck of the Batavia, after 9 days of clinging to the breaking timbers, drinking wine mixed with seawater, and watching the corpses of their comrades float by, the final remains of the hull split in two. Jeronimus Cornelisz, clinging desperately to a massive broken piece of the mainmast, drifted through the churning surf for hours until the current finally washed his body ashore on Batavia's graveyard. As the wet, salt-encrusted apothecary dragged himself out of the surf and onto the sand, the remaining survivors gathered around him in a desperate crowd. They were leaderless, starving, and terrified. Because he was the highest-ranking VOC official left alive on the islands, they looked to him as their natural savior, their commander, and their governor. Cornelisz stood up, wiped the salt from his eyes, and looked out over the crowd of broken, vulnerable people. He realized that the constraints of human law, Christian morality, and the Dutch East India Company had been completely wiped clean by the ocean. He was now the absolute ruler of his own isolated universe, and he was about to unleash his heretical philosophy with a cold, terrifying, and systematic fury. With the departure of Pelsaert and the miraculous arrival of Jeronimus Cornelisz on the shores of Batavia's graveyard, the social fabric of the survivors underwent a profound, terrifying mutation. Cornelisz did not see a crowd of suffering human beings requiring salvation. His analytical, psychopathic mind saw a cold, mathematical problem of resource allocation and absolute control. He gathered the remaining senior crew and established a new centralized authority called the High Council. On the surface, this looked like a standard administrative move to preserve order. In reality, Cornelisz carefully populated this council exclusively with his loyal, pre-recruited mutineers, men like the brutal soldier Wouter Loos, the vicious sailor Konrad van Housen, and his personal, fanatical executioner Matthijs Zijderveld. Anyone who showed signs of independent thought, deep Christian morality, or loyalty to the VOC was systematically excluded. Cornelisz's first major move was to secure an absolute monopoly on all means of survival and violence. He ordered all survivors to hand over every single salvaged weapon, swords, muskets, knives, and pikes, to the High Council, claiming it was necessary to prevent riots and ensure equal distribution. He then seized all the salvaged clothing chests from the Batavia's upper-class passengers. While the common sailors and soldiers shivered in rags on the beach, Cornelisz and his inner circle dressed themselves in luxurious, bright red silk uniforms trimmed with gold embroidery, creating a stark visual caste system of power and intimidation. He also took absolute control of the remaining water and wine barrels, placing them under heavy armed guard. If a starving child or an old woman stepped within 10 feet of the water supply without permission, they were beaten with the flats of swords. But Cornelisz faced a critical structural vulnerability. The mathematics of the island were entirely against him. There were roughly 180 people on Batavia's graveyard, and the salvaged food and water could only sustain them for a few weeks at best. Furthermore, Cornelisz knew that if a rescue ship eventually returned from Java, he and his mutineers would be arrested and hanged for their attempted conspiracy on board the ship. He needed to ensure that when a ship arrived, only his loyal mutineers were alive to board it. He could then seize the rescue vessel, secure the chests of silver still sitting on the reef, and escape. Therefore, his ultimate strategy was simple. He had to systematically reduce the population of the island through mass murder, whittling the numbers down until only those loyal to him remained.
But he could not simply order a mass slaughter on day one. The common soldiers would outnumber his men and revolt. He needed to use deception, isolation, and psychological warfare to break his victims apart before he cut their throats. His first tactical move was to divide the most dangerous element, the loyal soldiers. A group of approximately 20 highly disciplined, physically imposing French and German mercenaries, led by a remarkably brave, clear-minded soldier named Wiebbe Hayes, represented the only physical threat to Cornelisz's rule. Cornelisz approached Hayes with a smile. He pointed to a large, high island on the distant northern horizon, now known as West Wallaby Island, and claimed that smoke had been spotted there, indicating the presence of fresh water springs. He ordered Hayes and his men to take the small yawl, explore the island, and find water. To ensure they could not defend themselves if they discovered his lie, Cornelisz forced them to leave all their muskets and iron swords behind, sending them into the unknown with nothing but a few dull pocket knives and wooden pikes. As soon as Wiebbe Hayes and his soldiers sailed away, Cornelisz pulled the trap tight. He assumed the mercenaries would either die of dehydration on the barren rocks or be permanently trapped there without a boat. He was now left on Batavia's graveyard, with a population consisting mostly of unarmed sailors, sick passengers, women, and children. The slaughterhouse was ready. The executions began in July 1629, and they were executed not with an explosion of chaotic anger, but with a chilling, bureaucratic casualness. Cornelisz never committed the murders himself. He sat in his luxurious red tent, sipping fine wine, and issued written orders to his council, analyzing the killings as mere administrative reductions of the population. The mutineers used the cover of night to begin their work. They would approach a tent where a sick sailor or a low-ranking clerk lay sleeping. They would claim that the High Council had ordered them to be moved to a different camp or taken out on a small boat to fish. The victim would be led into the darkness or rowed a few hundred meters out into the Black Lagoon. There, the executioners would strike. They would wrap a heavy rope around the victim's neck and strangle them until their lungs collapsed. Or they would plunge their daggers into their chests, pushing the bleeding bodies into the deep water, where the blood instantly attracted swarms of massive reef sharks. Within days, the methodology became increasingly bold and sadistic. The mutineers, fueled by absolute power and the heavy rations of wine given to them by Cornelisz, began to view murder as a form of sport and a way to prove their absolute loyalty to the Apothecary's heretical kingdom. They forced the remaining survivors to watch the executions, to completely break their psychological will to resist. One afternoon, a young, completely innocent cabin boy named Kilian Jans was summoned before the High Council. Cornelisz accused him of a ridiculous, fabricated crime, stealing a small piece of salted meat from the stores. There was no trial. Cornelisz turned to his chief executioner, Matthias Zuidervelt, and gave a slight nod. Zuidervelt grabbed the terrified, crying boy by his hair, dragged him to the water's edge, drew his heavy iron sword, and cleanly severed the boy's head in front of the assembled crowd on the beach. The head rolled into the surf, its eyes still blinking, while the mutineers laughed and cheered, their red uniforms splattered with the child's blood. The island transformed into a landscape of pure Gothic horror. The clean yellow sand of Batavia's graveyard became permanently crisscrossed with long, dark brown streaks of dried human blood. The air was filled with the continuous weeping prayers of the survivors, who huddled together in their tents, fully aware that every time the sun set, several of them would not see the next morning. Cornelisz had successfully turned the island into a closed, totalitarian laboratory of death, where survival was a privilege granted only to those willing to become monsters themselves. By the scorching days of August 1629, the flat, sun-bleached expanse of Batavia's graveyard had been effectively engineered into a highly streamlined coastal slaughterhouse. Through systematic nightly culls and targeted daytime executions, Jeronimus Cornelisz had successfully reduced the camp's population to less than half of its original size. The remaining survivors were entirely broken, their psychological will crushed under the weight of an omnipresent terror. With the complete breakdown of moral resistance, the Apothecary's totalitarian regime entered its most grotesque and theatrical phase. Cornelisz no longer acted as a mere interim governor managing a crisis. He became an absolute despotic king, ruling over a private empire of sand, blood, and stolen wealth. Cornelisz rarely stepped outside his grand, multi-layered merchant tent, a choice designed to cultivate an aura of untouchable, near-divine authority. Inside the tent, the atmosphere was one of sickening luxury, juxtaposed against the grim reality of the island. He spent his afternoons systematically cataloging the contents of the salvaged VOC treasure chests. He would spread heavy bolts of red velvet and damask across improvised wooden tables, meticulously arranging the company's wealth. Thousands of silver guilders, heavy gold chains, diamond-encrusted rings, and the highly intricate Roman agate cameo intended for the Mughal emperor were laid out like toys. He forced the surviving cabin boys and starved sailors to polish these treasures for hours under threat of instant execution, finding a twisted megalomaniacal satisfaction in controlling a fortune he could not legally spend. To visually project their absolute dominance over the starved populace, Cornelisz ordered his inner circle of mutineers to discard their salt-crusted rags. They broke open the baggage of the deceased upper-class passengers, tailoring the fine materials into elaborate, bizarre uniforms. The mutineers paraded across the sandy beaches, dressed in vibrant red silk coats, embroidered wool suits, and heavy gold-trimmed sashes, their belts lined with heavily polished, blood-stained iron cutlasses. This stark visual hierarchy served a psychological purpose. It drew a hard, unyielding line between the masters of the island and the cattle who were permitted to live only at the council's whim. If a common survivor failed to bow or clear a path when a man in red silk walked by, they were viciously beaten with the flats of swords or denied their microscopic daily ration of water. The social dynamics among the mutineers themselves mutated into something closely resembling a fanatical, heretical cult. Cornelisz regularly held blasphemous gatherings inside his tent, fueled by the heavy rations of wine he withheld from the rest of the camp. During these sessions, he used his sophisticated, silver-tongued rhetoric to systematically erase whatever lingering remnants of Christian guilt his executioners possessed. He would look into the eyes of men like Wouter Loos and Matti Zuderfeld, men whose hands were permanently caked with the dried blood of women and children, and reframe their atrocities as acts of higher spiritual perfection. "In us," Cornelisz would whisper, his voice smooth, rhythmic, and deeply mesmerizing. "God acts. We are the truly enlightened, the chosen elite. Because we possess this higher understanding, it is impossible for us to commit sin. The laws of the church and the state are designed to control the weak, not the strong. The people we clear away are not human souls. They are merely obstacles, resource consumers who must be deleted to preserve the perfect kingdom we will build when our rescue ship arrives. Your blades are not weapons of murder. They are the instruments of a higher, divine." This antinomian philosophy operated as an incredibly potent psychological narcotic. It allowed the mutineers to entirely offload their personal moral accountability onto Cornelisz, transforming their sickening, sadistic crimes into a wholly historical necessity. To permanently cement this bond of blood and ensure absolute compliance, Cornelisz instituted a brutal system of sexual slavery and systematic psychological degradation. The most high-born woman to survive the wreck, Lucretia Jans, became the primary target of his ideological malice. Lucretia represented everything the bankrupt apothecary had been excluded from in European society: aristocratic refinement, wealth, and unassailable social standing. Cornelisz did not have her murdered. Instead, he dragged her into his tent and forced her to become his personal concubine. He took a cold, vindictive pleasure in forcing this refined woman to submit to his desires, openly informing her that if she showed a single sign of resistance, he would give a simple nod to his guards and her throat would be cleanly slit on the spot. The remaining young women and teenage girls on the island were treated as state property, distributed among Cornelius's top lieutenants like pieces of meat to reward them for their loyalty. A particularly harrowing example of this institutionalized cruelty befell Gisbertje Bastiaans, the daughter of the ship's highly respected Calvinist minister. In a single coordinated night attack, the mutineers entered the minister's tent and systematically slaughtered his wife, his sons, and his younger daughters with iron pikes. Gisbertje was spared, purely to be passed around the mutineers' tents as a captive. Her father, the minister himself, was kept alive under a regime of sick psychological torture. Cornelisz forced the broken old man to sit at the High Council's dinner table every night. The minister was compelled to nod, pray, and smile, while the heavily intoxicated mutineers openly bragged about how they had butchered his family and debased his remaining daughter. It was the ultimate demonstration of Cornelisz's power. He had not just conquered the bodies of his victims, he had entirely inverted their moral universe. As the weeks of August ground on, the methods of murder on Batavia's graveyard evolved from clinical population control into a form of cruel, sadistic theater designed to satisfy the escalating appetites of the armed men. The mutineers no longer required a fabricated accusation of theft to strike. They killed purely for entertainment and to alleviate the boredom of their isolation. A favorite pastime among the soldiers became a game known as testing the blades. A soldier like Wouter Loos would drag a weak, dehydrated old sailor out of his tent into the bright midday sun. He would hand the old man a broken wooden stick and mockingly tell him that if he could successfully defend himself against a military-grade steel saber, the High Council would grant him his freedom. The terrified, weeping victim would attempt to raise the stick, only for the soldier to methodically hack him to pieces, slicing off his fingers, his nose, and his ears one by one to test the sharpness of the iron edge before delivering a final, agonizing thrust to the throat. On another night, a group of heavily intoxicated mutineers decided to play a perverted game with a pregnant female passenger. They bound her wrists tightly behind her back with coarse hemp rope, dragged her into the shallow lagoon, and forced her to walk out toward the deep ocean reef. The mutineers stood on the beach, shouting and placing monetary bets using stolen silver guilders on exactly how many minutes she could keep her mouth above the rising tide before her lungs filled with salt water. The sound of their raucous laughter rang out across the dark lagoon, completely drowning out the desperate, muffled cries of the drowning woman. Yet, precisely at the peak of this absolute, unpunished madness, the structural foundation of Cornelisz's kingdom was suddenly fractured by a sound from across the water. It was a low, booming echo traveling across the waves from the high, dark limestone cliffs of West Wallaby Island, located miles to the north. Cornelisz rushed out of his red silk tent, his face tightening as he raised his brass marine spyglass toward the northern horizon. He focused the lens on the distant cliffs, and his stomach dropped. Pluming high into the gray sky was a thick, steady column of white smoke. It was a signal fire. Wiebbe Hayes and his 20 loyal mercenaries were not dead. Against every known mathematical and physical probability, they had survived the barren wastes. Through sheer unbreakable military discipline and survival ingenuity, the soldiers had thoroughly explored the jagged limestone interior of the high island. They had located massive, deep natural caverns filled with crystal-clear, fresh rainwater springs. Furthermore, they discovered that the island was teeming with small wallabies and nesting seabirds, providing them with an inexhaustible, highly nutritious supply of fresh meat. While Cornelius's men were slowly rotting from rancid wine and mental degradation, Hayes's men were growing physically stronger, healthier, and more disciplined by the day.
Worse still for the mutineers, the signal fire was working as a beacon for the oppressed. Over the previous weeks, several terrified survivors on Batavia's graveyard had managed to slip away into the dark ocean. Building makeshift rafts out of driftwood or simply swimming across the deep, shark-infested channels using empty water casks for flotation, these refugees had successfully reached Hayes's camp. They brought with them the horrifying, unfiltered testimonies of the nightly slaughters, the mass rapes, and the heretical kingdom of the Apothecary.
Wiebbe Hayes immediately grasped the grim strategic reality. He knew with absolute certainty that as soon as Jeronimus Cornelisz realized the soldiers were alive and possessed a secure water supply, the mutineers would come to exterminate them, to eliminate all witnesses before a rescue ship could arrive. Hayes gathered his 20 men on the beach. They possessed no firearms, no iron armor, and no steel swords. But they were professional infantrymen, trained to operate as a singular, lethal machine under pressure.
They systematically began to prepare for an asymmetrical war. They harvested long, dense branches of native ironwood, using small pocket knives to meticulously sharpen the tips into deadly, hardened pikes. They split open the heavy, sharp limestone boulders of the island, selecting perfectly weighted, jagged chunks of rock that could be hurled with bone-shattering force. They gathered old iron nails and scrap brass from washed-up driftwood, binding them tightly to heavy wooden clubs with wet leather strips to create brutal, primitive maces. Finally, Hayes designed and constructed a defensive fortification out of tightly stacked limestone blocks at the island's primary landing beach, creating a narrow, mathematically precise tactical choke point that would force any invading force to fight on the mercenaries' terms.
Jeronimus Cornelisz knew his entire grand strategy was on the verge of total collapse. If a VOC rescue ship from Java appeared on the horizon and found a disciplined force of loyal soldiers holding a fortress with a fresh water supply, the mutineers would be instantly exposed, hunted down, and strung up on the gallows. The apothecary's paradise of red silk and silver could not coexist with the survivors on the rocks. The closed laboratory of death was forced to expand its borders, and Cornelisz began assembling his executioners for an all-out amphibious war of extermination.
The discovery that Wiebbe Hayes and his loyal mercenaries were alive completely upended the strategic calculus of Batavia's graveyard. Jeronimus Cornelisz's closed kingdom of red silk and unpunished slaughter was suddenly faced with a hard military reality. The apothecary knew that if a rescue ship from Java appeared, Hayes and his healthy, disciplined soldiers would be the ones to tell the true story of the island, resulting in immediate execution for every mutineer. For the mutineers, the extermination of the soldiers was no longer just a desire to eliminate potential rivals. It was an absolute existential requirement for their own survival.
In mid-August 1629, Cornelius ordered the first military expedition against West Wallaby Island. He assembled a strike force of his most brutal, heavily armed killers, led by the vicious sailor Conrad von Huyssen. The mutineers boarded the ship's small yawl and a makeshift raft, confident that their superior weaponry would ensure an immediate bloody rout. Unlike the soldiers, who possessed no firearms or armor, the mutineers were equipped with steel breastplates, heavy iron cutlasses, pikes, and loaded muskets stolen from the Batavia's armory. They viewed the journey across the deep ocean channel not as a military campaign, but as a minor chore, a brief hunting trip to finish off a group of starving, unarmed laborers.
As the mutineers' boats scraped against the shallow limestone shelf of West Wallaby Island, they were met with a scene that shattered their expectations. Standing on the beach, arrayed in a tight, impenetrable wall of flesh and ironwood, were Wiebbe Hayes and his 20 mercenaries. The soldiers were not weak, dehydrated, or cowering in fear. Their bodies were sun-darkened and heavily muscled from a diet of fresh wallaby meat and pure rainwater. They stood in perfect military formation, their long ironwood pikes held at a rigid, uniform angle, their eyes cold and entirely steady.
Van Huysen ordered his men to charge, the mutineers screaming oaths and waving their heavy steel swords. But Hayes had meticulously selected the battleground. The landing beach was a narrow, jagged labyrinth of sharp coral and slick limestone blocks that completely neutralized the mutineers' mobility. When the mutineers attempted to reform their lines, the soldiers unleashed their secret weapon. Hayes had trained his men to operate as a coordinated artillery unit using the island's natural environment. With a rhythmic, booming shout, the back rank of mercenaries stepped forward, carrying heavy, sharp-edged limestone boulders they had selected for their specific weight. Moving with the synchronized precision of European battlefield drills, they hurled the rocks into the advancing mutineers. The impact was devastating. The heavy stone blocks smashed through steel breastplates, shattered collarbones, and crushed helmets, sending several mutineers collapsing into the crimson-stained surf, screaming in agony. Before the mutineers could recover from the stony barrage, Hayes roared an order. The front rank of soldiers lunged forward with their hardened ironwood pikes. The long, sharp wooden tips found the gaps in the mutineers' armor, piercing throats, thighs, and chests. The mercenaries fought with the terrifying efficiency of professional veterans who had survived the bloody trenches of the 30 Years' War. They did not break formation. They moved as a single, multi-headed beast of muscle and wood. Realizing they were being thoroughly butchered by an enemy they had despised as inferior, the remaining mutineers broke into a blind panic. They scrambled back into the yawl, dragging their wounded and bleeding comrades over the gunwales, and rowed frantically back toward Batavia's graveyard. The first battle for the High Island had ended in a decisive, humiliating defeat for the Apothecary's kingdom. When the bleeding survivors of the expedition returned to the main camp and reported the disaster, Jeronimus Cornelisz was stunned. His silver-tongued rhetoric and psychological manipulation could not alter the physical reality of fractured bones and punctured flesh. He realized that a frontal military assault against Hayes's tactical choke points was suicide. To defeat the soldiers, he would have to return to his primary weapon, absolute, unadulterated deception. Cornelisz decided to lead the second expedition himself. On September 1st, 1629, he arrived at West Wallaby Island with a large contingent of his council. This time, however, the mutineers did not carry their weapons openly. They approached the shore under a white flag of truce. Cornelisz stepped onto the limestone shelf dressed in his most magnificent gold-embroidered red silk uniform, his face twisted into a mask of warm, diplomatic friendliness. He requested a formal parley with Wiebbe Hayes, claiming that he was deeply horrified by the previous violence, which he blamed entirely on the rogue actions of his drunken sailors. He proposed a peaceful treaty between the two islands. Hayes and his men would keep absolute control of the freshwater springs and the High Island, while the High Council would remain on Batavia's graveyard. In exchange for a regular supply of fresh water, Cornelisz offered to share the salvaged treasures of the Batavia, presenting Hayes with heavy bolts of expensive silk, silver coins, and wine as a gesture of good faith. But Cornelius's true objective was sinister. While he engaged Hayes in a lengthy, complex diplomatic negotiation, his top lieutenants, including Wouter Loos and Matthijs Zuiderveld, were secretly circulating among the common soldiers and the refugees who had fled to the island. Under the guise of friendship, the mutineers were whispering promises of immense wealth, offering thousands of silver guilders and beautiful captive women to any soldier who would agree to betray Wiebbe Hayes, assassinate him in his sleep, and open the fortress gates from within. Wiebbe Hayes, however, was not a bureaucrat like Pelsaert, nor was he an arrogant mariner like Jacobsen. He was a deeply pragmatic, highly analytical soldier who understood the dark depth of human nature. As he looked into Cornelius's cold, unblinking eyes and listened to his smooth, poetic promises of peace, Hayes recognized the unmistakable stench of a trap. He noticed that while Cornelius smiled, the mutineers on the beach were subtly positioning themselves around his men, their hands resting near their hidden daggers.
Hayes allowed the parley to continue until Cornelius had fully committed himself to the deception. Then, with a sudden, deafening whistle, Hayes gave a prearranged signal to his hidden reserve of soldiers. Before the apothecary could comprehend what was happening, the mercenaries lunged out from behind the limestone boulders. They did not attack the common mutineers. They targeted the leadership. In a matter of seconds, the soldiers tackled Jeronimus Cornelisz to the ground, pinning his arms behind his back and pressing a sharpened ironwood pike directly against his throat.
4 of his top lieutenants, including the vicious Coenraad van Huysen, attempted to draw their weapons to rescue their leader, but the mercenaries moved with lethal speed. The heavy, iron-bound wooden clubs and pikes of the soldiers smashed down onto the mutineers' skulls. Van Huysen and 3 other key conspirators were killed on the spot, their brains dashed out onto the limestone rocks they had come to conquer. Wouter Loos and the remaining mutineers on the beach, seeing their council systematically dismantled in a matter of seconds, panicked. They abandoned their supreme leader, jumped back into the boats, and rowed away in terror, leaving the absolute king of Batavia's graveyard completely abandoned on the sand.
Wiebbe Hayes looked down at the shivering, mud-splattered figure of Jeronimus Cornelisz. The red silk uniform was torn, the gold embroidery was soaked in salt water, and the apothecary's face was pale with pure, unadulterated terror. The psychological spell was entirely broken. The hypnotic master of manipulation was now a helpless, pathetic prisoner of war, bound tightly with coarse hemp ropes and thrown into a dark stone cell built from stacked limestone blocks. Back on Batavia's graveyard, the remaining mutineers were in a state of chaotic, paranoid collapse. Their ideological anchor, their god and their governor, had been captured. The leadership of the mutiny now fell to Walter Loos, a man of raw, brutal violence who possessed none of Cornelius's intellect. Loos realized that the mathematics of the situation were now completely desperate. Hayes held their leader, the refugees were growing in number, and the resources were running out.
On September 17th, Loos assembled every remaining able-bodied mutineer for a final apocalyptic assault. They brought all their remaining muskets and ammunition, determined to launch a scorched earth campaign to wipe out the Fortress of Stone once and for all. The third battle for West Wallaby Island was the most brutal encounter of the entire catastrophe. The mutineers stayed at a distance, using their muskets to fire volleys into the stone fortifications, desperately trying to break the soldiers' lines through raw firepower. Hayes and his men huddled behind their limestone walls, the lead musket balls flattening against the stone with deafening cracks. Whenever the mutineers advanced to reload their weapons, the soldiers would launch counterattacks, throwing heavy stones and lunging with their pikes. The beach became a horrific, primitive arena of smoke, shattering stone, and screaming men. Precisely at the absolute climax of this bloody, high-stakes battle, when the ammunition of the mutineers was beginning to fail and the soldiers were preparing a final decisive charge to end the war, a sudden booming sound echoed from the deep ocean horizon to the west. It was not the sound of a musket, nor was it the sound of a breaking wave. It was the deep, resonant, and unmistakable thunder of a heavy naval cannon. Every man on the beach, soldier, mutineer, and refugee alike, froze. They turned their heads toward the open sea. Cutting through the blue horizon, her massive white sails billowing in the wind, her decks bristling with heavy artillery, was a massive VOC retort ship. It was the Sardam. Commander Francisco Pelsaert had returned from the dead. The final,
terrifying reckoning for the monsters of the Batavia had officially arrived.
The sight of the Sardam's massive white sails breaking through the ocean horizon acted as a sudden, paralyzing shockwave that brought the bloody battle on West Wallaby Island to an instantaneous halt. For both the battle-hardened mercenaries and the cornered mutineers, the psychological framework of their isolated universe shifted in a single heartbeat. The lawless vacuum of the reef was gone. The omnipotent corporate hand of the Dutch East India Company had just reached across 1,800 miles of empty ocean to reestablish its absolute authority. A frantic, high-stakes race immediately materialized. Both factions realized that whoever reached Commander Francisco Pelsaert first would control the narrative of the last 3 months. Wouter Loos and his remaining mutineers scrambled back into their heavy boats, dropping their muskets and rowing with desperate, panicked strength toward the anchoring ship, planning to disguise themselves as innocent, trauma-stricken survivors of a standard shipwreck. But Wiebbe Hayes and his swiftest soldiers had the ultimate tactical advantage. They were already at the water's edge with their ultra-light, 2-man native canoe. They jumped into the craft and paddled with an immense, superhuman surge of adrenaline, their muscles straining and their raw hands bleeding as they tore through the choppy surf. Their light boat sliced directly across the path of the mutineers' heavier vessels, pulling alongside the hull of the Sardam just as her heavy iron anchor plunged into the seabed. Wiebbe Hayes, his body covered in scars, sun-darkened dirt, and dried wallaby blood, climbed up the ship's heavy rope ladder with his long ironwood pike still gripped firmly in his hand. He rushed onto the quarterdeck, where a pale and visibly shaken Commander Pelsaert stood.
"Commander!" Hayes gasped, his chest heaving as he pointed back toward the approaching mutineers. "You must order your men to their weapons instantly. The people rowing toward you are not survivors. They are mutineers, murderers, and monsters. They have systematically butchered over 110 innocent men, women, and children on these islands, and we have their supreme leader, Jeronimus Cornelisz, bound in chains on our beach." Pelsaert stood paralyzed as the horrific reality shattered his remaining administrative delusions. When Wouter Loos and his men finally pulled alongside the Sardam, expecting to spin their web of lies, they were met not with open arms and warm blankets, but with the cold, black iron barrels of 30 loaded muskets held by disciplined VOC soldiers. The mutineers were ordered onto the deck one by one, instantly thrown face down onto the wood, stripped of their fine silk uniforms, and dragged down into the dark, suffocating ship's brig in heavy iron shackles.
Pelsaert immediately went ashore on West Wallaby Island to secure Cornelisz. The former apothecary was dragged out of his stone cell by Hayes's mercenaries. The red silk uniform he wore was now a filthy, sweat-stained rag. His silver-tongued arrogance was entirely gone, replaced by the hollow, shifting eyes of a cornered predator. Pelsaert looked at the blood-stained beaches of Batavia's graveyard and realized he could not risk transporting these men back to Java without a trial. The sheer scale of the crimes, mass execution, systemic torture, sexual slavery, and the theft of a corporate fortune was so volatile that it threatened to spark a secondary mutiny among the rescue crew if justice was delayed. He ordered the immediate construction of a formal courtroom tent on the very sand that had seen the slaughters, transforming Batavia's graveyard into an official, draconian tribunal of the Dutch East India Company.
The trials lasted throughout the final weeks of September 1629. Pelsaert operated as the chief inquisitor and judge, utilizing the strict, unforgiving codes of Dutch maritime law. To save their own necks from the gallows, the low-ranking mutineers and executioners immediately turned on one another, providing exceptionally detailed, stomach-turning confessions of their nightly crimes. They pointed their trembling, bound hands directly at Jeronimus Cornelisz, identifying him as the ideological mastermind who had signed the execution orders and filled their minds with heretical justifications. When Cornelisz took the stand, he attempted to deploy his sophisticated, hypnotic rhetoric one final time,
He wept openly, claimed that he was a completely innocent man of God who had been physically forced by Wouter Loos and the brutal soldiers to sign the death decrees, and argued that he had only tried to preserve life under impossible circumstances. But his performance was utterly destroyed when Pelsaert confronted him with his own signed administrative decrees and the devastating, unyielding testimonies of Lucretia Jans and the minister's daughter, Gisbertia Bastianes. When his words finally failed him, the apothecary's sophisticated veneer broke entirely. He degenerated into loud, hysterical blasphemies, screaming curses at the judges, spitting on the ledger, and denying the very existence of a higher power. The sentences handed down by the council were absolute, swift, and designed to match the biblical horror of the crimes. The most prolific executioners, including Matthis Zoiderveld and Jan Hendricks, were sentenced to have their right hands chopped off with a heavy steel meat cleaver before being dragged to the gallows. For Jeronimus Cornelisz, Pelsaert designed a specific, highly symbolic punishment. On the morning of October 2nd, 1629, a massive wooden gallows was constructed on the highest limestone ridge of Batavia's graveyard. The surviving victims, the mercenaries, and the rescue crew gathered in a wide, silent circle. Cornelisz was dragged to the platform, his legs shaking. He refused to pray, refused to ask for forgiveness from the weeping survivors, and cursed the sky. The executioner forced the apothecary's arms onto a heavy oak chopping block. With two swift, heavy blows of a mallet and a massive iron chisel, the executioner cleanly severed both of Cornelius's hands, the very hands that had directed the slaughter of over 100 innocent human beings without ever wielding a blade himself. The bloody stumps were immediately dipped into boiling tar to cauterize the wounds, ensuring he would not bleed to death before his final sentence. The heavy hemp noose was looped around his neck, the lever was thrown, and the architect of the nightmare dropped into the empty air, his handless arms twisting against the stark blue sky until his lungs collapsed. A total of 7 top mutineers were executed alongside him that morning, their bodies left hanging from the gallows to rot in the salt air as a permanent warning to any future travelers who crossed the Houtman-Abrolhos reef. 2 men, including the brutal soldier Wouter Loos, were granted a strange, experimental mercy. They were marooned alive on the completely isolated wild mainland coast of Western Australia, with a small supply of seeds and tools, becoming by historical accident the very first permanent European inhabitants of the Australian continent, never to be heard from again. With the executions completed, the Tsardom turned its focus to salvaging the immense fortunes still trapped within the shattered hold of the Batavia. Over the course of several grueling weeks, divers managed to recover 10 of the 12 iron-bound chests of silver guilders, alongside the priceless historical treasures and the Mughal cameo. The remaining survivors, including Wiebbe Hayes, who was promoted to the rank of official military officer and hailed as a national hero of the Netherlands, were loaded onto the ship, and the Tsardom sailed away, leaving the flat, yellow strips of sand behind. The physical remnants of the Batavia disaster would eventually sink beneath the surface, covered over by centuries of growing coral and shifting tides. But the psychological scars of those 3 months of madness could never be washed away. The story of the Batavia stands today not merely as a tragic tale of a shipwreck, but as a terrifying, profound warning about the extreme fragility of the human mind and human civilization. It proves that when the constraints of law, societal expectation, and structural authority are removed by a crisis, the ultimate monster waiting for us in the dark is not a mythical beast or an empty ocean. It is the person standing right next to us, wearing a smile, waiting for his moment to cross the line.